Hi everyone, my name is Chanidu and I'm the head of the DC Motions Committee, and today I'll be discussing the Octo Finals motion of the Dr. N.M. Perera Memorial Challenge Trophy. Assuming that military leaders would still be subject to the authority of elected civilian leaders, this House believes that military leaders should be directly elected by citizens. I'll first be discussing proposition and then opposition. First, discussing proposition. The first thing that I would like to discuss is the relevant setup for proposition in this debate. Then I'll be discussing arguments. First, dealing with setup, I think the most important thing that proposition should set up and characterize well is how these elections will take place. Two things that proposition might want to clarify are, firstly, when do these elections take place? For example, do they coincide with the election of civilian leaders? For example, do they happen alongside the election of parliament or the president? Or are they staggered in such a way that they happen after the election of civilian leaders? The benefit of this being that now the public can devote their full attention towards these elections rather than the elections of civilian leaders. Secondly, you might want to clarify how frequently these elections will happen. For example, do they happen very frequently, such as once every 2 or 3 years? The benefit of this might be that it's easier for the public to remove bad military leaders without having to suffer the consequences of them remaining in power for a long time. Or alternatively, would you like to characterize this as being a world in which these elections happen infrequently, for example, every 10 years, so that you can establish a sense of continuity and stability within the military? So those are two things to consider based on what kind of arguments you want to run. The final thing that you might want to do is you might also want to characterize what the process of these elections taking place looks like. Because what matters in an election is not just the result of an election, where people get to vote among a pool of candidates, but also the process by which people get there. For example, there is likely to be a process of campaigning by respective military leaders in order to raise awareness regarding the policies that they support among the public. This might also mean that there is lots of media coverage of these elections, for example, through the hosting of debates on news channels. It might also mean that there will be endorsements by particular political parties for the military leaders that they support and that they would like to serve alongside. So all of those might later help you in argumentation, prove how there are additional benefits that arise not just from the result of the election, but also the process of the election. Moving on to the most important arguments. For me, the most important argument that proposition should make in this debate is about why they have better militaries on their side. Proposition can attempt to justify this in a variety of ways, but before we do this, I think we should first clarify what exactly the role of military leaders is, because opposition might try to say that after all, military leaders, as the motion states, are still subject to the authority of elected civilian leaders, and therefore they are really just employees. They don't have control over military policy, which is decided by people like the president or more likely the parliament, but rather they're just responsible for implementing those policies. To push back against this, proposition might try to recharacterize the role of military leaders. One thing that proposition could say is that despite the fact that it is ultimately civilian leaders that have control over policies, such as how much of the budget to dedicate to military spending, that military leaders play an important role in providing expertise and advice to civilian leaders, which they are quite likely to follow. The reason that this is true is because politicians often come to military leaders for advice, given that they have the most up-to-date knowledge and information, as well as the relevant experience across the span of their career regarding issues such as the strength of the military, how much more resources they need, or the likelihood of success or failure of various military projects and programs, like an invasion or the creation of a new military base in a foreign country. So on these particular issues, it's military leaders that have the most information, and therefore civilian leaders are likely to trust them and to follow the advice that they are given by military leaders. Secondly, you might also say that although some decisions are taken by civilian leaders, such as overall deciding how much of the budget should be dedicated to military spending, that often, because civilian leaders have other priorities, such as the economy or other sectors of the country, such as healthcare, that they might delegate a lot of the work to military leaders. For example, deciding how this military spending should be distributed, whether the majority of it should be used to buy new equipment or whether you should increase salaries for soldiers. There are also decisions that politicians cannot make because they lack military experience. For example, in the heat of the moment during an invasion, whether or not to withdraw or how we should distribute troops or even how we should conduct negotiations with the opposing military leaders might be things that are delegated to military leaders. So having proven this, we now need to prove why we have better militaries on our side of the house. To prove this, you would need to prove that elections improve the incentives of military leaders to have good military policies. I think there are three ways in which you can prove this. First, you might suggest that this increases accountability to the public. This is because elections are obviously conducted by the public. They have the final say on who the military leader in command is. So therefore, military leaders now, rather than pandering to politicians, are forced to think about the interests of ordinary civilians. This might be a good thing because unlike politicians who can be bought off by special interest groups, for example, the military industrial complex, so that is rich weapons manufacturers who lobby and pay politicians in exchange for appointing military leaders that are favorable to them, that might give them things like greater defense contracts, thus increasing their revenue and profits. Military leaders now need to cater not to those politicians, but rather directly to civilians who have no such incentive and who often have an incentive to implement good military policy. For example, limiting foreign invasions of foreign countries because that hurts the country's budget and the money that they have, or even things like improving the welfare of soldiers, which is something that civilians generally care about, given the glorification of soldiers, as well as the fact that many of them might know or be related to or themselves be soldiers. So that's the first mechanism on increasing accountability to the public. The second thing that you might want to clarify is that there is also greater scrutiny on military leaders by the media. This is because once you know that as a member of the public, you have a say and control over military leaders through the vote, you might now take a greater interest in military affairs, whereas previously you might not have been so interested in these, given that it was part of a basket of larger issues which you were considering when electing civilian leaders. So for this reason, military leaders might respond to this greater scrutiny, not just of the military in general, but also of themselves in particular and their career, by being more careful and cautious with the actions that they take. This could apply both to military leaders who are currently contesting elections, as well as to prospective future military leaders. For example, if you are a lower level general or lieutenant, you might more carefully consider your actions because you know that in the future, if you wish to stand election as a military leader, for example, as a general, that these will come to light due to media scrutiny and investigations. The third reason that you might give is that this also increases the incentive of military leaders to push back against civilian leaders and the bad policies that they might implement. Currently, the problem is civilian leaders can implement bad military policies. For example, invasions of countries under false pretenses, such as the invasion of Iraq by the United States. But later on, blame military leaders for giving them false intel and scapegoat them to the public to avoid accountability. Currently, military leaders might tolerate this because they don't come under significant scrutiny, and they know ultimately, even if they are disliked by the public, it is ultimately politicians who appoint them. But now, this kind of scapegoating is likely to hurt military leaders far more because they know that they must stand in election if they want to maintain their position, and that scapegoating by politicians directly decreases their popularity among the public. And so for this reason, military leaders are likely to push back against the bad decisions that politicians make, for example, invading countries simply for reasons of extracting resources like oil, or in order to increase nationalist pride by getting people to rally around the flag and increasing their sense of nationalism. And so for that reason, you might also have better military policy. You might also want to briefly impact what these better military policies look like. For example, this might look like fewer wars and unjust foreign interventions, whereas military leaders would only intervene when it was absolutely necessary and when there was a clear and direct benefit. Secondly, it might be better militaries for soldiers, for example, higher pay, better working conditions. Thirdly, it might look like more austere military spending. So for example, not spending lavish amounts of your budget on building foreign military bases in countries where they are not needed. Now moving on to opposition, I think again, beginning with setup, the most important point of setup for opposition here is to set up a counter model. And here obviously, opposition's counter model is twofold. First, as in the status quo, they would support a system of appointment of military leaders by civilian leaders. So for example, the president, much like he appoints his own cabinet, or appoints Supreme Court justices would also appoint military leaders. Secondly, opposition might want to co-opt many of the benefits that proposition gives by suggesting that all of the reasons for why military leaders respond well to elections, so what we just discussed about accountability, scrutiny, and an incentive to push back, also apply to politicians. For example, politicians also know that their military policies will be scrutinized by the media. They also are accountable to the public, and they also want to avoid scapegoating by other politicians, for example, politicians within their own party. So all of these incentives do apply to military leaders, although the degree to which to civilian leaders rather, although the degree to which they apply might be contentious in the debate. Having then established that, what are the main arguments that opposition should make? I think, again, the most important argument that opposition should make should be about why they have worse militaries and military policies on their side. The first way that you can attempt to prove this is by saying that elections will be done poorly. That is, that people who are voting in these elections won't make correct decisions. There are many ways in which you might justify why ordinary civilians might not elect the best military leaders. For example, in many cases, they lack information. The ordinary person doesn't really understand the inner workings of the military and what distinguishes a good military policy from a bad one, particularly given that there are many external circumstances that influence this. For example, a foreign intervention in a country might have been just, but might have still led to many casualties, which members of the public might consider therefore to be a bad decision, even though from a military point of view, it was justifiable. Secondly, they might simply lack information, given that much of this information is confidential or are national secrets, which only politicians can know and can't be revealed to the general public. And thirdly, the general public, as well as the media, might simply lack the experience necessary to elect good military leaders. For example, you might say that people know what distinguishes a good politician from a bad one, and the media knows how to cover politicians because they have a practice of doing this over a long period of time, given that that is always how we have selected politicians. In contrast, it's very difficult for the media to investigate or to accurately represent the stances of military leaders because they simply lack the experience of having done this in the past. The impact of this might be that you either appoint military leaders who are overcautious, particularly during times, for example, when there are economic difficulties within a country, and people appoint military leaders who support a massive decrease in military spending. People might do this because they think it directly benefits them, but the harm of this might be that it increases the exposure of your country to foreign interventions, which only military leaders really understand the gravity of. Or alternatively, you might, for example, during periods of high nationalist sentiment and national pride, appoint military leaders who are over-enthusiastic, who are willing to go to war even when there is not a sufficiently justifiable cause to go to war for. And so for that reason, you might also lead to more military human rights abuses, more military spending in the long term, which ultimately hurts people. Comparatively, you might say that a process of appointments by politicians is good because even though politicians ultimately are also responding to the incentives of civilians, that politicians have more information, they have more experience with appointing military leaders, and they also know that if ultimately the result of a military leader being appointed is a bad one, that they will be punished by the public by losing the next election because of that, particularly given that often the military is one of the biggest sources of spending for the government and is generally something that many people care about, given that foreign interventions or national security are existential issues. So for those reasons, you might justify the counterfactual and show why appointments are better. Aside from this, however, you can also give many other reasons for why, even if elections are not done poorly, why this might still be bad in terms of changing the incentives of military leaders. For example, you can say that this reduces cooperation between military leaders and that there will be a breakdown in the chain of command when military leaders are directly in competition with one another, and often due to the process of elections also have to directly scrutinize or criticize one another in public. And so once that has taken place, it might be more difficult once military leaders are appointed for them to get along and work well together, which might hurt the interoperability of various parts of the military, for example, the army and the navy. Secondly, you might try to prove why this reduces compliance with civilian leaders. And here's where you might want to point out that this debate doesn't just happen in developed countries that have a strong separation between the military and the civilian government, but might also take place in weak democracies, particularly countries like Pakistan and Myanmar, where often military regimes hold significant control over elected civilian leaders. Now, although the motion does specify that civilian leaders would technically still have authority over military leaders, you might show in opposition that when you actually allow these military leaders to stand for election, that now means that in the future, if these military leaders ever want to plan a coup to oust the civilian government, they can now create a far more legitimate military regime because they can point to the fact that they were directly elected by the people and that they are popular among them. So actually, increasing the publicity and notoriety of military leaders might lead to more harms in weak democracies with strong military regimes. Comparatively, you might point out that even if these countries still do have strong military regimes, that in the event of a coup, it's very difficult for them to establish a legitimate government that will be tolerated by the people if they have never stood for elections and if they are relatively unknown to the people. Thirdly and finally, you might point out that during the process of campaigning, you make military leaders more vulnerable to lobbying, particularly by the military-industrial complex and big defense companies. So for example, in the US, this looks like companies like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. This is because these military leaders need a way to fund their campaigns, and defense companies are likely to give them this money in exchange for these military leaders pushing for things like increasing defense contracts or even increasing foreign interventions in order to increase the demand for the goods that these defense companies are producing. In rare cases, there might also be greater foreign intervention. For example, foreign countries secretly donating to the campaigns of military leaders in order to ensure that once they get into power, they pass policies that are favorable to that foreign country. Briefly then on the clashes in this debate. One clash in this debate might be whether these elections will be done well. Here, proposition might try to prove why the public will ultimately have the necessary information as well as good incentives to elect military leaders. Opposition might try to recharacterize and prove why ultimately the public will make bad decisions and won't have the necessary information. A second clash might be about accountability. Here, proposition might try to show why having military leaders go through greater public scrutiny means that they are more likely to make good decisions and push back against civilian leaders, whereas opposition might say that this unfairly empowers military leaders to make policy suggestions of their own rather than obey the commands of civilian leaders who are directly elected by the public. Thirdly, there might be a clash about cooperation within government. So for example, opposition might point out how this leads to a breakdown in chain of command, whereas proposition might push back against this and attempt to mitigate it, as well as point out how they have better cooperation between military leaders and civilian leaders in a world in which both of them are elected. And finally, there might be a clash about corruption. So here, opposition might try to point out how foreign interference and lobbying, when it is done directly on military leaders through their election campaigns, is far worse, whereas proposition might say that issues such as lobbying or foreign interference can still happen through politicians and are in fact worse when they happen through politicians. So those are the most important pieces of setup, arguments, and clashes for this debate.